Welcome back to the Toy Report. Gather round, folks. It's time to discuss a recent legal showdown that's bound to make all of us gun enthusiasts lock and load with excitement. Introducing Hanson versus the District of Columbia, a court case where a certain Mr. Andrew Hansen decided to take matters into his own hands and pockets by suing DC for their pesky large capacity magazine ban, also known as the standard capacity magazine ban. But wait, there's more. The Bruin decision from the Supreme Court has been causing a stir, leading to a flurry of lawsuits challenging the constitutional validity of various gun control laws. It's like a legal game of whack-a-mole, where plaintiffs are popping up left and right to take a swing at the government's restrictions. So, grab your popcorn and your gavel, because this case is just getting started. In the land of avocado toast and Hollywood dreams that will never come true, our favorite state, California, is facing some serious heat with a case called Duncan v. Bonta. Our pro-Second Amendment friends are taking on this Marxist state's unconstitutional standard capacity magazine restrictions, and it's causing quite a stir. But there's a twist. Judge Benitez, who originally ruled on this case in San Diego, is back in action after the Bruin decision from the Supreme Court. It's like a legal boomerang, folks. Will he stick with his ongoing ruling, or do a quick flip-flop like what the geniuses over at the ATF love to do? Let's find out. It is very likely that we will receive Judge Benitez's decision any moment now, and we're anticipating that he'll rule once again that the ban is unconstitutional. The reasoning behind this ruling is supported by the Bruin decision, and it begs the question of what the anti-gun crowd could possibly come up with as a legitimate argument to challenge the Bruin analysis. The answer to that question seems to have presented itself in the recent Hanson v. DC case. So, in the case of Hanson v. DC, Judge Contreras in the District of Columbia decided against granting a preliminary injunction. Basically, he's saying, let's put the plaintiff's challenge to the District of Columbia's magazine ban under the microscope and see if it aligns with Bruin. To anyone who needs a bit of context, in Bruin, if a statute impacts an individual's right to keep and bear arms, the state must then prove that their statute is consistent with the history, text, and traditions of firearms regulation as they originated back in 1791 during the time of the ratification, and in the surrounding time frame as well. It's like an old-school history lesson, except it's about guns, which makes it infinitely cooler, right? Anyway, it's interesting to see how the courts are interpreting and applying the Bruin analysis in different cases. The analysis seems to be a solid framework for evaluating the constitutionality of gun control laws, but there's always a chance for some wiggle room or interpretation. It'll be exciting to see how Hanson v. DC plays out in light of the Bruin analysis. It's the topic that's hotter than a barrel of spent casings. But let's get serious for a moment. So, some folks are trying to argue that certain gun control regulations are unconstitutional because they didn't exist back when the founding fathers were still rocking their powdered wigs. And honestly, that seems like a pretty sound argument. But leave it to the anti-gun crowd to try and come up with something, anything, to combat this logic. And boy, have they been floundering around like a fish out of water. Until now, that is. Judge Contreras has given them a glimmer of hope with the District of Columbia's magazine ban. Now, we don't agree with his conclusion, but at least he put some effort into it. And mark my words, this analysis will become the playbook for other states trying to defend their unconstitutional gun control restrictions. What's the big revelation in his analysis? Well, he actually admits that magazines are covered by the Second Amendment. Wow, groundbreaking stuff, right? But hey, at least we're making progress. So, imagine this judge is like a quirky detective investigating a crime scene where the state is trying to argue that a magazine is not a firearm, but an accompaniment to a firearm. He's like, hold on a minute, I've got to investigate this further. And what does he find? He dismisses their argument like it's a bad alibi, saying, no, it's in fact an integral component. Case closed, right? But wait, there's more. This detective judge is not satisfied with just solving one case. He wants to investigate whether the Second Amendment actually applies to this situation. And he comes up with a fascinating argument, though fundamentally incorrect. Kind of like when your friend tries to convince you that pineapple on pizza is a good idea. He says, okay, let's look at the Second Amendment and see if it actually protects this specific conduct, or in this case, this magazine. It's like he's looking for clues to crack the case. Will he find what he's looking for? We'll find out soon enough. Let's talk about the phrase common sense, shall we? It's kind of like the question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? But in this case, it's what comes first, the common use or the Second Amendment protection. Now, most of us would assume that millions of standard capacity magazines in circulation means they're in common use, right? Well, Judge Contreras begs to differ. According to him, use means actual use, not just possession. So, under this interpretation, a product can be owned, but not actually in use. It's kind of like that fancy kitchen gadget you got as a gift but have never used. Sure, you own it, but is it really in common use? This line of thinking is not new though. Remember when Senator Dianne Feinstein grilled Justice Kavanaugh on whether AR-15s were in common use? She argued that actual use equated to being employed at that time. But let's be real here, a loaded weapon in your possession for defense purposes is in use, even if you're not actively using it. Judge Contreras seems to have adopted Feinstein's argument, claiming that these magazines are not being used repeatedly for self-defense. He also believes that the Second Amendment only applies to weapons being used for lawful self-defense. But hey, at least we know how we can properly attack this idiotic argument. Let's talk about why it is idiotic for a little bit. So, the argument is that a weapon is only in common use if it's being used for self-defense purposes. But that's like saying a car is only in common use if it's being used for commuting to work. Surely, there are other places you can drive your car to besides your work, yes? Weapons have a multitude of uses beyond just self-defense. Think about it. Every time we go to the range, every time we go hunting, heck, even when we clean the damn thing or whenever we load an empty mag, we're using our weapons for something other than self-defense. And let's not forget about the simple joy of plinking. The idea that common use only applies to self-defense is just plain moronic. Having access to these weapons gives us a sense of security and defense, even if we're not actively shooting a bad guy to defend ourselves. So, the argument that common use only applies to self-defense is fundamentally flawed, and I'm sure it will be challenged. Judge Contreras then takes us on a wild ride through his own twisted version of historical analysis. He basically says that the Second Amendment only applies to weapons that were designed for the battlefield, which is just plain wrong. It's like saying that the only use for a car is to race it, and anything else is just frivolous. But it gets worse. He's basing his historical analysis on biased historians who are looking to push their own agenda, which is like trusting a dentist who tells you that you need a root canal when all you really need is a cleaning. This is the kind of stuff that makes me worried about the Bruin decision. With such a divergence of consensus among historians, who knows what kind of wild interpretations we'll see in the future. It's like we're all stuck in our own time loops, trying to decipher what happened centuries ago. Despite everything, he ultimately concludes that the Second Amendment does not extend to standard capacity magazines. I personally think his arguments are weak and pathetic. You can bet it will be appealed in the future. If other judges in other states start adopting the same reasoning as Judge Contreras, it's likely that we'll see more legal challenges and potential changes to this interpretation. It is very likely to be overturned on appeal. I mean, let's be honest, the idea that the Second Amendment doesn't apply to standard capacity magazines is just plain unintelligent. But who knows, maybe it'll make its way up to the Supreme Court and we'll get another round of arguments and opinions on the matter. I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing Justice Thomas take on this issue and clarify once and for all that this kind of legal maneuvering is just plain wrong. In the meantime, though, it's always important to stay vigilant and keep training. Whether you're a gun owner or not, self-defense is a critical skill that everyone should have. So keep practicing, keep honing your skills, keep carrying a concealed firearm for self-defense, and above all, stay safe out there. And that's all the time we have for today. If you have family or friends living in DC, please share this video with them so they know what's going on, and help the channel grow by clicking on like, subscribe, and that little notification bell too so you're always updated of new content. Thanks and have a good one.